one choice, one moment, one love story. Welcome to When He Chose Her. Enjoy the story. Sometimes the only way to save a life is to do something no one will ever forgive you for. The crystal chandeliers shimmered above rows of polished tables, their light reflecting off glasses that cost more than most people's weekly rent. And at the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, a man who measured time in deals closed and risks eliminated, his tailored navy suit fitting like a second skin, his silver watch catching the light with every subtle movement of his wrist, everything about him precise, controlled, predictable, and exactly the way he liked it. Until the moment it wasn't. Until the moment a quiet waitress with soft eyes and a steady posture stepped just a little too close to his table and changed everything. Lily Harper had been moving through the room the way she always did, unnoticed yet aware, her black uniform crisp, her hair tied back in a simple knot, her presence almost invisible to those who never thought to look twice. But her eyes missed nothing, not the nervous glance from a man across the room, not the slight tremor in a hand that didn't belong to any ordinary guest, not the way a glass of red wine had been placed just a fraction too carefully in front of Ethan. She paused, just for a second, her fingers tightening slightly around her tray. Something was off, something her instincts refused to ignore. Ethan barely noticed her at first, just another server in a long line of people whose names he would never remember. He was mid-sentence, discussing a multi-million-dollar acquisition with a group of investors, his voice calm, confident. The kind that made people listen, the kind that made people follow. He reached for the glass without looking, his attention still locked on the numbers, on the strategy, on the next move that would keep him 3 steps ahead of everyone else. And then everything happened at once. Lily moved, not rushed, not panicked, just certain. Her hand came forward, not toward the glass, but toward him, and before anyone could process it, before the room could catch its breath, her fist made contact with his shoulder in a sharp, unexpected motion that sent the glass tilting, the wine spilling harmlessly across the table instead of reaching his lips. The sound wasn't loud, but the silence that followed was. Conversation stopped, forks hovered midair, eyes turned, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to freeze in disbelief. Ethan blinked, stunned, his body reacting before his mind could catch up, his hand pulling back instinctively, his gaze snapping to hers. Confusion flashing across his face. Not anger, not yet. Just pure disbelief. Lily didn't step back, didn't apologize, didn't even raise her voice. She simply looked at him, calm, steady, as if the world around them hadn't just shifted. "Don't drink that," she said quietly, her tone even, almost gentle, and somehow that made it more unsettling. A murmur spread through the crowd. Whispers layered over whispers. Security began to move, drawn by the disruption. But Ethan raised a hand without looking, a silent command that stopped them in place, his eyes never leaving hers, trying to read something, anything, in the way she stood there so composed in the middle of chaos, the spilled wine slowly dripping off the edge of the table like a ticking clock. Somewhere behind him, a chair scraped against the floor. Someone gasped, but Ethan didn't turn. He couldn't. Not yet. Not when the quietest person in the room had just done the most unthinkable thing. And instead of fear, instead of regret, there was something else in her expression, something he couldn't quite name, something that made him hesitate, just for a second longer than he should have. The kind of hesitation that would haunt him later, because in that second, everything he thought he understood about control, about power, about people, began to shift, and he didn't even know it yet. All he knew was that a waitress had just crossed a line no one ever dared to cross, and somehow, impossibly, she looked like the only person in the room who wasn't afraid of what came next. The room did not recover all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a held breath finally released, voices returning in fragments, silverware clinking again, but softer now, uncertain, as if even sound itself was trying to understand what had just happened. Ethan remained still, his fingers hovering just above the table where the wine had spilled, a thin red line tracing the polished wood before dripping onto the marble floor, his heartbeat steady but louder than it should have been, not from fear, but from something unfamiliar. Interruption. Lily had already stepped back half a pace, not retreating, just allowing space, her posture unchanged, her eyes no longer fixed on him, but scanning the room again. with quiet precision, as if the moment had already passed for her while it was only beginning for everyone else. A voice broke through the tension, sharp and urgent. Someone at the neighboring table, a man in his late 50s, had suddenly slumped forward, his chair scraping loudly as it shifted under him. A woman beside him gasped, calling his name, and just like that the focus of the entire room shifted. The whispers turned into movement, chairs pushed back, people standing, confusion. Replacing curiosity, Ethan turned this time, his gaze locking onto the scene unfolding just a few feet away. The untouched glass of wine in front of that man now knocked onto its side, its contents pooling across the white tablecloth in a mirror image of his own. Lily was already moving, not rushing, not drawing attention, just moving with purpose. She reached the table and knelt beside the man, her voice low, calm, almost steady enough to be mistaken for routine. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her hand hovering just near his shoulder, not shaking him, just grounding the moment. A nearby staff member fumbled with a phone, calling for medical assistance. Another tried to clear space, but Lily did not look up, her focus unbroken. Ethan watched, something tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the chaos around him. The pattern was too clear, too precise to ignore. The glass, the timing, the warning. His mind moved quickly, assembling the pieces with the same efficiency he used in boardrooms and negotiations. But this was different. This was not a deal, not a strategy. This was something raw, something real. He stood slowly, the room parting around him without being asked, his presence still commanding, but his attention no longer on control, only on understanding. He stepped closer, close enough now to see the fine details, the way Lily's hands were steady, the way her eyes moved not in panic but in calculation. She was not guessing, she knew, and that realization landed heavier than anything else. "You knew," Ethan said, his voice low, almost lost beneath the noise, but she heard him. Of course she did. She always did. She did not look up immediately, finishing what she needed to finish in that moment before finally meeting his gaze. There was no triumph there, no apology, just quiet certainty. "I suspected," she corrected gently, as if the difference mattered, and to her, it did. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of that single word settling in. Suspected, not guessed, not reacted, but recognized, the kind of recognition that came from experience, from something deeper than instinct. Security finally moved in fully now, managing the scene, guiding guests back, containing the disruption, but Ethan barely noticed. His world had narrowed to the woman in front of him who had just altered the course of his night. Perhaps more than that. "Why me?" he asked, not accusatory, just direct, the question hanging between them like a thread waiting to be pulled. Lily stood, smoothing the front of her uniform with a small, almost absent gesture, her expression softening just slightly, enough to suggest something human beneath the control. "Because you were about to drink it," she said simply, and for a moment, that was all there was. No drama, no elaboration, just truth in its simplest form. Ethan almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so disarmingly straightforward, so different from the world he was used to where every answer came layered with intention and hidden meaning. But before he could respond, before he could press further, she was already stepping away, blending back into the flow of the room as if she had never disrupted it at all, as if she had not just redirected the outcome of his life with one decisive motion. Ethan watched her go, his mind no longer on the incident itself, but on her, on the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she seemed to exist just outside the patterns he understood. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell realized he was not in control of the situation, and strangely, he did not try to take it back. Not yet, not when the answer he needed was already walking away. By the time the paramedics arrived, the room had already shifted from spectacle to silence, not the stunned kind from earlier, but something heavier, something reflective, as if every person present had just been reminded how quickly certainty could unravel. Ethan stood near the edge of the scene, no longer the center of attention despite who he was, his hands now in his pockets, his posture relaxed in appearance, but his mind anything but. He watched as the man was carefully assisted, heard, fragments of reassurances, saw the subtle nods that signaled control returning to a situation that had nearly slipped into something far worse. But his attention kept drifting, not to the responders, not to the concerned guests, but to the absence of someone who had already disappeared back into the background as if none of this belonged to her. Lily Harper had returned to her section, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, moving with the same quiet efficiency she had before, as if the last 10 minutes had not happened, as if she had not just intervened in a way that no one else even understood. Ethan found that more unsettling than the incident itself, because it meant it was not extraordinary to her. It was normal, and that raised a question he could not ignore. What kind of life made something like that feel routine? He turned slightly, catching the attention of his head of security who had been standing at a respectful distance, already aware that something had shifted in his employer's focus. "Find out who she is," Ethan said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying an edge of intent that did not need to be explained. The man nodded once, already moving, already pulling out his phone, but Ethan added one more thing before he could go, quietly, because this was not about control, not yet. This was about understanding, and understanding required patience, something Ethan Caldwell was not known for, but tonight was already proving to be different. Minutes passed, the restaurant slowly returning to its polished rhythm, conversations cautiously resuming, laughter coming back in smaller, measured doses, but Ethan did not sit down again. He remained standing, watching, observing, waiting, until finally, she approached his table again, not with hesitation, not with apology, just with purpose. A fresh linen cloth in one hand as she began to clean the last trace of the spilled wine, her movements precise, unhurried. As if this was simply the next task in a long list, Ethan studied her, not hiding it this time, letting the silence stretch just long enough to see if she would acknowledge it. She did not. Not until she finished, not until the table was restored to its original state, as if nothing had ever disrupted it. Only then did she glance up, meeting his gaze directly, not challenging, not submissive, just equal, and that was new. "You are still here," she said, her tone neutral, but there was a faint trace of something beneath it, something almost like curiosity. Ethan let out a quiet breath that could have been a laugh if it had been louder. "I usually am," he replied, and for a brief moment, something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest she understood more than he had said. He leaned slightly against the table, his posture less formal now, less guarded. "You said you suspected," he continued, his voice steady. "That is not something people usually just suspect." Lily folded the cloth carefully, her fingers moving with the same deliberate control she applied to everything else. "People notice more than they think," she said, and again, it was simple, but not complete. Ethan tilted his head slightly, recognizing deflection when he heard it, but choosing not to push too hard. "Not yet. And you act on it," he added, watching for any reaction, any hint of hesitation, but there was none. Only that same calm presence that refused to be disrupted. "Sometimes," she answered, and this time, there was no room for interpretation. It was not a habit, it was a choice, and that made it more significant. Ethan straightened slightly, something settling into place in his mind, not a conclusion, but a direction. "You saved me," he said, not as a question, not as an accusation, just as a fact being acknowledged. Lily held his gaze for a second longer than before, just enough for the moment to register, just enough for something unspoken to pass between them, and then she looked away, already stepping back, already returning to her role. "I stopped you from drinking," she corrected, softly, and this time, there was no ambiguity, no invitation for further conversation, just a boundary drawn with quiet precision. Ethan watched her leave again, but this time, he did not feel the same sense of confusion. Instead, there was something else, something sharper, something more focused. Curiosity had turned into interest, and interest into intent, because for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell had encountered something he could not immediately understand, and instead of walking away, he found himself wanting to follow it, not as a problem to solve, but as a story he had not yet heard. And somewhere across the room, without looking back, Lily Harper seemed to already know that he would. The night did not end the way it was supposed to. Not for Ethan Caldwell. Not anymore. Because long after the last guests finished their conversations and the polished calm of the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, his mind refused to settle. He sat back down eventually. Not because he wanted to continue the dinner, but because leaving would have felt like walking away from a question he had not answered. And Ethan did not leave questions unanswered. He adjusted his cuff slightly, a small, habitual motion that usually brought him back into control. But tonight it did not work the same way. Because control required information, and information about Lily Harper was suddenly the one thing he did not have. His phone buzzed once, subtle, discreet, and he did not look at it immediately. He waited, just a second, as if preparing himself for something that should have been routine. Then he picked it up. A short message from his head of security, efficient as always, precise. As expected, but this time, incomplete, name confirmed. Lily Harper. Age 26. Employment verified. No flags. Ethan read it once, then again, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes sharpened. No flags. That was not normal. Not for someone who had just demonstrated that level of awareness, that level of reaction. People with that kind of instinct did not live simple lives. They did not blend into the background without leaving traces, and yet according to the report, she did. And that contradiction was enough to hold his attention far longer than any business deal that night. He looked up, scanning the room until he found her again, near the far end now, speaking quietly with another server, her posture relaxed, her presence once again part of the environment instead of standing out from it. It was almost unsettling how easily she disappeared when she chose to. Ethan stood, decision made without announcement, his chair sliding back just enough to draw a few glances, but he ignored them, moving across the room with the same confidence that had built his entire life. Except this time, there was no strategy behind it, no calculated outcome, just curiosity leading the way. Lily noticed him before he reached her. Of course she did. She always did. Her conversation paused naturally, not abruptly, as she turned slightly to face him, the other server stepping away with a polite excuse that felt rehearsed, leaving them alone without making it obvious. Mr. Caldwell, Lily said, her voice even, acknowledging him without changing her tone, without adding weight to his name the way others always did. And somehow that made it feel more real. Ethan stopped a few feet from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to keep the space neutral. You left, he said, not accusing, just stating what he had noticed earlier. Lily tilted her head slightly, a small movement that suggested she was considering how to answer, or whether to answer at all. I went back to work, she replied. And there it was again, that quiet way of reducing something significant into something simple. Ethan almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was consistent, and consistency meant intention. Most people would have stayed, he said, watching her closely, testing the edges of the conversation. Most people are not me, she answered, and for the first time, there was a trace of something beneath the calm, not pride, not defiance, just clarity, as if she was not trying to prove anything, only stating a fact she had already accepted. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that, adjusting his approach without making it obvious. My team says, there is nothing unusual about you, he continued, his tone still measured, but with a hint of something more direct now. Lily's expression did not change, but her eyes did, just slightly, just enough to suggest she understood exactly what that meant. Then your team did their job, she said, and that answer landed differently, because it was not denial, not confirmation, just a careful alignment with what was already known. Ethan exhaled quietly, recognizing the pattern now. She did not lie. She redirected. She simplified. She controlled the narrative by choosing what not to say, and that made her more difficult to read than anyone he had encountered in a long time. You are not what you seem, he said finally, letting the statement hang without forcing it into a question. Lily met his gaze again, steady, unflinching, and this time, there was something else there, something softer, something almost like understanding. Neither are you, she replied, and the words were quiet, but they carried weight, not because of what they said, but because of what they implied. Ethan paused, just for a second, and in that second, something shifted again, not in the room, not in the situation, but in him, because for the first time, this was not about control, not about uncovering information, It was about something far less familiar, connection, and he did not have a strategy for that. Not yet. I would like to see you again, he said, the words simple, direct, stripped of the usual layers he applied to everything else. Lily did not answer immediately, her eyes studying him in a way that felt almost equal, almost balanced, and then she gave the smallest nod, not agreement, not refusal, just acknowledgement. Maybe, she said softly, and somehow, that was enough to make him stay a moment longer before finally stepping back, because for once, uncertainty was not something he needed to eliminate, it was something he was willing to follow. The restaurant finally emptied in slow, measured waves, the kind of quiet exit that belonged to places where nothing was ever supposed to go wrong. But tonight had left something lingering in the air, something subtle that even the polished marble floors could not hide. Ethan Caldwell stepped outside into the cool night air, the city humming softly around him, distant traffic, muted conversations, the low rhythm of a world that never truly stopped. He adjusted his jacket slightly, more out of habit than need, his mind still replaying the evening not in fragments but in patterns, cause and effect, action and response. Except this time the pattern did not close neatly. It left a space, and that space had a name. Lily Harper. His driver opened the door of the car, waiting with the same quiet professionalism as always. But Ethan did not get in immediately. He stood there for a moment longer, looking back at the restaurant entrance as if expecting something, or perhaps someone. But the doors remained still, no sudden movement, no quiet figure stepping out into the night, just reflection staring back at him through the glass. He exhaled slowly and finally stepped inside the car, the door closing with a soft, controlled sound that marked the end of the evening, or at least it should have. "Office," he said, his voice calm, and the car moved without question, the city lights passing by in clean, uninterrupted lines. His phone already in his hand, not for distraction, not for routine updates, but for something more deliberate. He opened the message again, reading the same short report that now felt insufficient, almost incomplete in a way that did not sit well with him. No flags, he repeated quietly to himself, and then he typed a response, simple, precise, look deeper, because something about Lily Harper did not align with simplicity. And Ethan Caldwell had built his life on understanding what others overlooked, across the city, in a small apartment that carried none of the luxury of the world Ethan belonged to. Lily sat by a narrow window, her uniform neatly folded beside her, her hair now loose over her shoulders, the silence around her different from the restaurant, more personal, more honest. She held a simple mug of tea, the steam rising slowly into the dim light, her eyes unfocused, not tired, just thoughtful, as if she was replaying the night in a different way, not analyzing outcomes, but measuring choices, the moment, the decision, the movement that had changed everything. She did not regret it, not for a second, but she understood what it meant. People like Ethan Caldwell did not forget, and they did not walk away from things they could not explain. Her phone remained on the table, untouched, silent, and yet the anticipation of it ringing felt almost certain, not fear, not concern, just expectation. Back in the moving car, Ethan leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a brief moment, not to rest, but to organize, to bring structure back to something that had disrupted his usual clarity. He saw it again, the exact timing, the exact movement, the absence of hesitation. That was what stood out the most. Hesitation was human. It was natural, even in urgent situations. But Lily Harper had not hesitated. She had acted with certainty, and certainty came from experience, not instinct alone. His phone vibrated again. Another message, faster this time, more detailed, but still not enough. Education records, employment history, financial background, all consistent, all ordinary, too ordinary. Ethan opened his eyes, staring out at the passing lights as a thought settled in. Not everything that was hidden left evidence. Some things were hidden because someone chose to walk away from them completely. And that kind of decision was never random. It was intentional. The car slowed as it approached a red light, the city pausing for a brief moment, and Ethan made another decision. Just as quietly. "Take me back," he said, and the driver glanced once in the rearview mirror, surprised for only a fraction of a second before nodding and turning the car around. Because this was not about business, not about strategy. This was about something unfinished, something that had started with a single unexpected moment and refused to end where it should have. Back in her apartment, Lily stood, placing the empty mug in the sink, her movements unhurried, her expression calm. But as she walked toward the window, something shifted, a faint reflection of headlights approaching, slowing, stopping just outside. She did not move immediately, did not react with surprise. Instead, she simply watched, her eyes steady, as if she had been expecting this all along. And when the car door opened and Ethan Caldwell stepped out once again into the quiet street, the distance between their two worlds suddenly felt smaller than it had just an hour before, not because anything had changed, but because neither of them had walked away. The street was quieter than the restaurant had been, but somehow it felt louder in a different way, the kind of silence that carried meaning instead of absence. Ethan Caldwell stood beside his car for a moment after stepping out, his gaze lifting toward the row of apartment windows until it found the one that mattered. He did not need confirmation. Something in him already knew he had the right place, not because of data, not because of reports, but because the night itself seemed to point him here. Lily Harper did not rush to the door. She did not react the way most people would when someone like Ethan appeared outside their home unannounced. Instead, she took a breath, slow and steady, then turned and walked toward the door with the same calm presence she carried everywhere else. When she opened it, there was no surprise in her eyes, only quiet acknowledgement, as if this moment had been part of the same sequence that started hours ago. "You found it," she said softly, not asking how. Not needing an explanation, Ethan gave a slight nod, his hands resting loosely at his sides. No longer the rigid posture of a man in control, but something more natural, more uncertain. "You expected me to," he replied, and it was not a question. Lily leaned lightly against the doorframe, the soft light from inside outlining her figure without making it feel staged. "Just real, just present. I expected you to look for answers," she said, her voice even. "I did not expect you to come yourself." Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh if it had carried more sound. "Neither did I," he admitted, and that honesty lingered between them for a second longer than either of them moved. The city continued around them, distant headlights passing, a faint breeze carrying the cool edge of night. But in that space, everything felt still. Ethan stepped closer, not crossing the threshold, just closing the distance enough to make the conversation feel less like chance and more like intention. "You are not just a waitress," he said, not as an accusation, not as a demand, just as a fact he had reached on his own. Lily's expression did not change, but her eyes softened slightly, as if she recognized the effort behind the statement. "And you are not just a billionaire," she answered, the balance of the moment shifting subtly, not upward, not downward, just equal. Ethan nodded once, accepting that, not as deflection, but as truth. And for the first time, the conversation did not feel like something to win. It felt like something to understand. "Then tell me what I am missing," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the usual certainty. Lily looked at him for a long second, as if measuring the weight of the question against the person asking it. Her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but something behind her eyes moved. Something deeper, something that had been held back until now. "You are used to solving problems," she said slowly, choosing each word with care. "You see something that does not make sense, and you fix it, or remove it, or control it until it does." Ethan did not interrupt, did not correct her, because she was not wrong, and they both knew it. "But I am not a problem," she continued, her voice still calm, still soft, but carrying more weight than before. "And I am not something that needs to be explained for you to feel comfortable." The words did not challenge him. They did not push him away. They simply set a boundary, clear and precise. Ethan absorbed that, letting it settle instead of reacting to it. Something in his expression shifted, not defensiveness, not resistance, but recognition, because for once, he was not being asked to act. He was being asked to accept, and that was something he had not done in a long time. "Then what are you?" he asked, and this time, there was no edge in his voice, just curiosity, real curiosity. Lily glanced past him for a brief moment, toward the quiet street, then back to him, her expression softer now, more open. "Someone who saw something was wrong," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more truth than anything more complicated could have. Ethan let out a slow breath, the answer settling in a way that did not close the question, but expanded it. And for the first time, he did not feel the need to reduce it, to simplify it, to turn it into something manageable. He just let it be. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was steady, grounded. Like the pause between two moments that both mattered, Ethan glanced toward the doorway. Then back at her, a small shift in his stance, less distance, less formality. "May I come in?" he asked, and there was something different in the way he said it. Not authority, not expectation, just a request. Lily held his gaze for a second, reading something in it, something that had not been there earlier in the night. Then she stepped aside just enough to open the space, not wide, not inviting in the usual sense, but allowing. And as Ethan crossed the threshold into a world that did not belong to him, the balance between them shifted again, not in power, not in control, but in understanding, because for the first time, neither of them was standing in their own territory. They were meeting somewhere in between. The apartment was smaller than any place Ethan Caldwell had stepped into in years, but it did not feel lacking. It felt intentional. Every object placed with purpose, every space used without excess. And as he stood just inside the doorway, his eyes moved not with judgment, but with quiet observation, taking in the details the way he always did, except this time the details did not translate into numbers or value. They translated into something else, something personal. Lily closed the door behind him with a soft click, the sound marking a boundary that neither of them acknowledged out loud. She moved past him without hesitation, heading toward the small kitchen area, as if this was no different from any other night, any other guest. But there was a subtle shift in her movements, not tension, not discomfort, just awareness. "Tea," she said simply, not asking, not offering options, just stating what was already decided. Ethan nodded once, the simplicity of it. Grounding in a way he did not expect, he loosened his jacket slightly, not removing it, just adjusting to the space, to the difference. He walked a few steps further in, stopping near the window where she had stood earlier, the city stretching out beyond the glass, smaller from this height, less controlled, more real. He rested his hand lightly against the back of a chair, not sitting yet, not fully settling. Lily moved quietly behind him, the sound of water running, the faint clink of ceramic. Ordinary sounds that somehow carried more weight than the noise of the restaurant ever had. "You chose this," Ethan said after a moment, his voice low, not turning yet. Lily glanced over her shoulder briefly, her expression unreadable but calm. "Yes," she answered, and that single word held more than agreement. It held decision. He turned then, facing her fully. "You walked away from something," he continued, not pressing, just following the line of thought that had been building since the beginning of the night. Lily poured the hot water slowly, steam rising between them, her movement steady, unhurried. "Everyone walks away from something," she said, placing the mug down on the small table. "The difference is whether they look back." Ethan studied her for a second, the way she framed things, always shifting the focus just enough to reveal something without giving everything. "And you do not," he said, not as a question. Lily met his gaze, holding it just long enough to make the answer clear before she even spoke. "No," she said quietly, and there was no regret in it, no hesitation, just finality. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting that boundary again, not pushing past it, not trying to break it down the way he would in any other situation, because this was not something to acquire or negotiate. It was something to understand on its own terms. He stepped closer to the table, finally sitting down across from her as she took the seat opposite him. The space between them small, but defined, equal, the kind of distance that invited conversation instead of control. Lily slid the mug toward him, her fingers brushing the edge for just a second before pulling back, a small, almost unnoticeable gesture. But Ethan noticed. He always did. He wrapped his hand around the mug, feeling the warmth settle into his palm, grounding him further in a way he had not expected. "At the restaurant," he said, his voice softer now, less structured. "You did not just react, you anticipated." Lily did not answer immediately, her eyes dropping briefly to the table before returning to his, as if choosing how much of that truth to let him see. "There are patterns," she said finally. People. Ignore them because they are focused on something else. Money, conversation, appearance, but patterns are always there. Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing that. The idea familiar, but the application different. And you see them, he said. Lily gave a small shrug, not dismissive, just matter of fact. I pay attention, she replied. And again, the simplicity, always the simplicity. Ethan let out a quiet breath, a faint smile touching his expression for just a moment, not because it was amusing, but because it was honest in a way he rarely encountered. That is not something you learn waiting tables, he said, the observation direct but not confrontational. Lily's lips curved slightly this time, not a full smile, but enough to acknowledge the truth in his words. No, she agreed. And that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just confirmation without detail. Ethan did not push, not this time. Instead, he shifted slightly, his posture relaxing in a way that would have been unthinkable just hours ago. You saved my life, he said again, not for emphasis, not for drama, just because it needed to be said in this space, not in the restaurant, not in front of anyone else, just here between them. Lily's expression softened, just a fraction, the first real shift he had seen that was not controlled. I made a choice, she corrected gently, but there was no distance in it this time, no boundary being drawn, just clarity. Ethan nodded, accepting that difference, because for her, it mattered, and for the first time, that mattered to him too. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things not said, not needed, the city lights reflecting softly through the window, casting quiet shadows across the room. And as Ethan sat there, across from a woman who refused to be defined by what she appeared to be, he realized something that no report, no investigation, no strategy could have given him. Some answers were not meant to be uncovered. They were meant to be experienced, and for the first time in a long time, he was not trying to get ahead of the moment. He was simply staying in it. The night stretched on without either of them noticing when the hours slipped past. The city outside shifting from the quiet hum of late evening into the softer stillness that came just before morning. Ethan Caldwell sat across from Lily Harper with his hand still wrapped loosely around the now lukewarm mug. The warmth long faded, but the grounding sensation still there. He had not checked his phone once since sitting down, something that would have been unthinkable just a day ago. But tonight, the world he usually controlled felt distant, muted, like something happening behind glass instead of around him. Lily watched that without commenting, noticing the small details the way she always did, the absence of distraction, the shift in posture, the way his shoulders had lowered just slightly, as if he had set something down without realizing it. You are quieter than before, she said after a moment, her voice gentle but direct. Ethan glanced up at her, the faintest trace of a smile touching his expression. I am usually talking to be heard, he replied. Tonight, I am listening to understand. Lily considered that, her eyes steady, not impressed, not dismissive, just acknowledging the difference. That is not something people learn quickly, she said, and there was no judgment in it, just observation. Ethan nodded once, accepting that as well. I am not trying to learn quickly, he said, and that answer landed differently. Not driven, not strategic, just honest. The kind of honesty that did not demand anything in return. Lily leaned back slightly in her chair, studying him in a way that felt less guarded than before, as if the space between them had shifted again, not because of what was said, but because of what was no longer being hidden. Then why are you here? She asked, and this time the question was not deflection, not redirection. It was direct, clear, and it deserved the same in return. Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked at her. Really looked at her, not as a mystery to solve, not as a situation to manage, but as a person who had stepped into his life without asking permission and changed its direction without warning. Because I could have walked away, he said slowly, choosing his words with care, and I did not. Lily held his gaze, waiting, not interrupting, not filling the silence, letting it stretch until the answer became complete on its own. And that matters, he finished, and there it was. Not a reason built on logic, not something that could be measured or analyzed, just a truth that existed because he chose it to. Lily's expression softened again, more than before, the guarded distance easing just slightly, not disappearing, but shifting into something more open, more real. Most people would have thanked me and moved on, she said quietly. And there was something beneath that. Not expectation, not disappointment, just recognition of a pattern she had seen before. Ethan let out a small breath, something almost like a quiet laugh. Most people are not me, he said, echoing her words from earlier. And this time, the connection between them was clear, not forced, not deliberate, just there. Lily's lips curved into a faint smile, the first one that reached her eyes, subtle but unmistakable. No, she agreed. And for a moment, the room felt lighter, not because anything had changed externally, but because something internal had shifted in both of them, the kind of shift that did not announce itself, but stayed, steady and quiet. Ethan set the mug down gently, his fingers lingering for just a second before pulling back, as if marking the moment in a way only he understood. "Come with me tomorrow," he said suddenly. The words simple but carrying intention. Lily's expression did not change immediately, but her eyes sharpened just slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. "Where?" she asked, her tone neutral. But there was curiosity now, real curiosity. Ethan leaned forward just a fraction, closing the distance between them without making it feel intrusive. "Somewhere that does not fit into your patterns," he said, and there was a hint of something in his voice now. Not control, not command, but invitation. Lily studied him for a long second, the silence stretching again, but this time it was different, not uncertain, but deliberate. She was not weighing the offer, she was reading him, measuring the intent behind it, the absence of expectation, the presence of something else, something quieter, something that did not try to take, only to share. "You do not know my patterns," she said finally, and there was a softness in her tone now that had not been there before. Ethan's expression shifted just slightly, not defensive, not insistent, just certain in a different way. "Then let me learn them," he replied, and the simplicity of it settled into the space between them, not as pressure, not as demand, but as possibility. Lily looked at him for another moment, then nodded once, small, almost unnoticeable, but enough. "One day," she said, and there was no condition attached, no hesitation following it, just acceptance of the moment as it was. And as the first faint light of early morning began to touch the edges of the city outside, neither of them moved to end the night, because for the first time, neither of them was in a hurry to leave something that had not been planned, but somehow felt exactly where they were supposed to be. Morning did not arrive all at once. It eased in quietly, a pale light stretching across the city as if it did not want to interrupt what had already begun. Ethan Caldwell stood by the window now, the same place Lily had stood the night before, but everything felt different, not because the room had changed, but because he had. His phone remained untouched in his pocket, the world that once demanded his constant attention now waiting somewhere outside this moment. Behind him, Lily moved softly through the apartment, not rushing, not lingering, simply existing in a way that felt steady, grounded, real. She stopped beside him, close enough to share the view, but not close enough to assume anything. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because silence had become something they no longer needed to fill. "You stayed," she said quietly, her voice carrying no surprise, only acknowledgement. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze still on the waking city. "I did," he replied, and there was no explanation attached, no justification, just the truth of it. Lily nodded once, as if that answer was enough, and in this space, it was. The light shifted slightly, catching the edges of the buildings, turning glass into reflection, turning reflection into something almost warm. Ethan turned then, not abruptly, just enough to face her fully, the distance between them smaller than it had been before, not because either of them had moved closer, but because something invisible had settled between them, something that did not need to be named to be understood. "You said one day," he said, his voice calm, steady. "This is that day." Lily looked at him, her eyes searching his face not for answers, but for intention, for sincerity, for something that could not be measured but could always be felt. And what she saw there was not control, not expectation, but something simpler, something quieter, something real. "You do not wait for things," she said softly, and there was a faint trace of humor in it now, the kind that came from recognizing a truth without needing to challenge it. Ethan's expression shifted slightly, a small smile forming, not practiced, not calculated, just there. I did not wait, he admitted. I chose. And that word settled into the space between them with more weight than anything else he had said, because it was not about timing, not about circumstance. It was about intention, and intention was something Lily understood. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked back out at the city, as if aligning that choice with the world beyond the room. And what happens when you choose something that does not fit into your life? She asked, not as a challenge, not as doubt, just as a question that deserved an honest answer. Ethan stepped closer, not enough to close the space entirely, just enough to make the answer feel personal. Then I change what my life looks like, he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no calculation, just certainty, not the kind that came from control, but the kind that came from understanding something mattered enough to shift everything else around it. Lily turned back to him slowly, her expression softer than it had been at any point before, not guarded, not distant, just open. And in that openness, there was trust, not given easily, not given lightly, but given because it had been earned in the quiet moments that had built between them. She took a small step forward, closing the distance that had remained, not because she needed to, but because she chose to, and in that choice, everything changed without needing to say it. Ethan did not move immediately, as if giving her the space to decide fully, and when she did, when she stood there in front of him with nothing held back, he reached out, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to let his hand rest lightly over hers. A simple connection, steady, real, unspoken, the kind that did not demand anything but carried everything. Lily looked down briefly at the contact, then back up at him, and for the first time, she smiled fully, not the small controlled curve of before, but something genuine, something warm, something that reached her eyes and stayed there. You are learning, she said quietly, and there was something almost like pride in it, not in him, but in the moment itself. Ethan's thumb moved slightly against her hand, a small gesture, but intentional. So are you, he replied, and the balance between them held, equal, steady, not defined by who they had been, but by who they were becoming in this moment together. The city outside continued to wake, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place in a small apartment above it, unaware that two people from completely different worlds had found something that did not belong to either world alone, but existed somewhere in between. And as the light grew stronger, filling the room with something new, neither of them stepped back. Neither of them returned to what they had been before, because some moments do not ask for permission to change you. They simply do, and in that quiet space, with no audience, no expectation, no need for anything more, they stayed, not because they had to, but because for the first time, they both wanted to. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share this video and share with us where you are watching from, and subscribe to When He Chose Her channel. Every moment of quiet strength and unexpected connection deserves to be seen. Your support helps us keep telling touching stories that remind us why dignity, kindness, and real love still matter.